Here's the 4 points he makes. They were always exposed to destruction. It would be unexpected. They should fall of themselves, and God has prevented them from falling. I'd like to focus on the third and the fourth. The reason this is such an excellent line is that the idea of somebody's foot sliding down a muddy or snowy, slippery hill is a good one for us moving down to the destruction of damnation. You can imagine the picture really well. It may have happened to you. You can imagine being on a slippery, a steep angle, and the snow, pebbles, mud, whatever it is under your feet, starts going down, starts slipping, and you can't stop yourself, and you're trying not to go further, but it just keeps happening. Why does that happen? It's your own weight. The more you weigh, the more likely it is to happen. Is anyone pushing you? No. God is not the one pushing us into hell. Now, Edwards does use the phrase, cast wicked men into hell. He uses that under the next number 1 on page 272, if you're looking at your book. But it's my contention that God casting people into hell, God, if you picture him as a physical being actually picking people up and tossing them down, is not what he's getting at. He's saying we should go there. And what God does, this of course is his original point number 4, is prevent us from falling. God will not hold them up in these slippery places any longer, but will let them go. So if you go back to that image of sliding down a hill again, if somebody were standing below you, somebody larger, stronger than you, maybe someone with better shoes, he could put out his hand and prevent you from continuing to slide down that hill. What Edwards is saying is that is what God is doing for us. The most significant of the 10 points that Edwards makes early on in his speech, which, by the way, show his intellectual style again, coming up with these 10 numbered points, not something you hear very often in present-day sermons that are usually full of anecdotes and jokes. The most significant ones, the ones I'm going to focus on here, you can look at pages 272 through 275 if you would like to. God's power to do it. Seems self-evident, but I think that God's absolute power to do anything is something that is being lost in the modern world and might not have been completely known by 18th century people as well. A very popular religious book of our time called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. I admit to not having read it, but I heard that the basic thesis of this book in trying to solve the classic problem of suffering in our world said, God loves us, God doesn't want it to happen to us, but he can't do anything to prevent it. There is nothing God cannot do. They deserve to be cast into hell. I want to jump from that one to number 5, which I think is very significant. The devil stands ready to fall upon them and seize them as his own at what moment God shall permit him. Those are both very key points. They, we, anyone who has not become a child of God by adoption from God as a brother of Jesus Christ or sister, belongs to the devil. And it says, when God shall permit him. As in the beginning of the book of Job, Satan does the evil, but God permits him to do it. Satan could not possibly do it without God's permission, back to God's absolute power in the first one. And so God needs to permit it. If anybody who would go to hell if he or she died is still alive right now, a point Edwards focuses on later, and has not gone to hell, that is God's permission and God's forbearance in not allowing it to happen yet. One of the points that Edwards really focuses on later. The scripture represents them as his goods, Luke 11, verse 21. When Jesus, after giving his house divided line about how he is able to cast out demons and has power over them, tells the little parable about a robber tying up a strong man and taking his goods. The strong man is the devil. The goods are those souls that belong to the devil. 6 through 9 are additional points. Some of them are not completely original. I want to focus more on number 7 and number 9. There are no visible means of death at hand, it says at page 274. Here's Edwards talking directly to the congregation who was thinking, but I'm not about to die. But we never know. It's like the message you might recall in Tolstoy's What Men Live By, where the large, rich man is demanding shoes that last a whole year. He then dies that very same day. Number 9 is similar. Whatever people may try to do to stay alive, to continue in life and ignore the idea about hell, it will happen in the end. People could die any day, and he leads from there to that point about no obligation, except, of course, the one promise that God has laid on himself. The latter part of Edwards' sermon starts in our book with the heading word application. Presumably Edwards didn't say that, but it might have been in his notes. Application as the second part of the sermon, quite common if you actually listen to a discussion of any topic, religious or literature. What it means, and it's what I hope to do in literature and ask my students to do sometimes in their essays, it means you apply it to life. That is, here's what this means. Edwards has covered that. What does it mean to me? How is it important? What does it have to do with day-to-day life? And so Edwards has stated basically his first thesis. Now here's his second one. At the bottom of page 275. The use of this awful subject may be for awakening unconverted persons in this congregation. And then in the rest of the paragraph he is saying, hell could be waiting for you. You find you are kept out of hell, but do not see the hand of God in it. You're alive, you are not damned, you're living day to day, the future seems ahead of you, but you don't see that, as was discussed in the first part, it is only because of God's love that you are not condemned now. Why would anyone in the congregation have needed to hear this? Well, I think Edwards was more honest, perhaps, or had more insight than a lot of pastors today do. Fellow redeemed, when addressing the congregation in a sermon, and I think there's fairly similar things said by a lot of pastors. You are redeemed. I know already that all of you are true Christians, are children of God. Why? Because they're sitting in church. You've probably heard the phrase Sunday Christians. They feel if they sit in church for an hour on Sunday, sometimes, of course, there are people who go beyond that. They go on Easter and Christmas only, that's sufficient. It goes together with the belief, which my mother had, that if someone is a good person, then God will take that into account. That was the idea that I was raised with, to the extent that my parents really thought about God. What Edwards is saying is that some of you may believe this, especially in the society that they were in, which of course was not as God-denying as our present society. Some of you may think that if you are sitting here in church, and if you call yourself a Christian, and if you say the words, standard modern way of putting it, talk the talk but don't walk the walk, then you need to do more. You need to genuinely turn to Jesus. You need to make him the number one thing in your life. You need to live like a Christian, act like a Christian. Otherwise, as he puts it right at the end of page 275, put very bluntly, you spend your life in the service of God's enemies. As Jesus says, he who is not with me is against me. Following this important general point, Edwards then goes on with 3 illustrations. One of them is a metaphor, 2 of them are similes. You may remember, look at page 276 and you'll see all of them. That the first, since it says like, the wrath of God is like great waters, it's a simile, and the third one, much as one holds a spider, is a simile. In between, he has a metaphor, actually the one that Longfellow used in Hiawatha. The bow of God's wrath is bent and the arrow made ready on the string. The idea in this case is that the straining of the bow, the strength of the bow being held out, again, is God's anger, but his pleasure, his willingness, which has not been done in the case of many, many people who have died unrepentant, who have died unsaved. God's pleasure for you is that he has not let the arrow go yet. The spider one is one of my favorites. I think probably the best image in the speech. Think of whatever creature you find most disgusting. Maybe it's not a spider. It would be a leech for me. But imagine holding that revolting creature. Most people wouldn't want to hold it for a second at all if they could let it go and let it drop. But in this case, he's saying holding it over the fire. In other words, this is what we are like because sin is so revolting to God, so against God's nature, so impossible for God to bear, that it's as if he's holding the most disgusting possible creature, that's an unsaved person, and could just let it go and fall into the fire. Again, as with the sliding down the hill image, it happens automatically. The spider is going to drop. It's not that God is throwing anybody in, it's that God is preventing us from going in. We would probably let that disgusting creature fall in the fire. It shows how loving God is and what forbearance God shows that he does not do that with us. The dam simile is another very effective one. The wrath of God is like great waters that are dammed for the present. Picture a dam. Of course, there is enormous power behind it in all the water. And if that dam were to break, as sometimes happens after storms or floods, it is completely disastrous for those who are in front of it. Your guilt is increasing. You are treasuring up more wrath. It's like the waters behind the dam of God's forbearance are building up and building up. If God withdraws his hand, it will fly open, and the water from the dam will flood you and destroy you. Another good example of Edwards' literary ability. Edwards closes after some points on page 277 that I don't think are so significant. They've been said by those who have described hell, as I've talked about before, the everlasting wrath, etc. He addresses the audience directly again, and he gives a real direct challenge. He says, if we knew that there was one person, and but one, in the whole congregation that was to be the subject of this misery, what an awful thing would it be to think of. If we knew who it was, what an awful sight would it be to see such a person. He's almost inviting the congregation to look around, look at the next person in the pew. Is it him? Is it her? Is it me? You have reason to wonder that you are not already in hell, he says. And then, just in case we feel that it is too negative, too much based on threats, too much based on fear, he closes with, you have an extraordinary opportunity. Christ has thrown the door of mercy wide open and stands in calling to poor sinners. He finishes, however, with the threatening tone, and he finishes with actually a reference in the last paragraph to Lot and his family. fleeing from the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah. Haste and escape for your lives. Look not behind you. Escape to the mountain, lest you be consumed. We remember that Bible story and recall that Lot was a righteous man, that God promised Abraham he would not destroy Sodom if there were even a few righteous people in it. God knew that there were none. However, there were Lot and his family. He let them escape. God, says Edwards, is giving us, if we are still alive and unsaved, the same chance to escape. We may have to run. We may not have very much time, but he's giving us that chance. And Edwards' message was so effective that even though the Great Awakening had already begun, this speech stands out as the literary monument of the Great Awakening. An amazing religious time in America, an amazing religious figure, whom we are now finished discussing, the colonial pastor Jonathan Edwards.